The smell was the first thing the neighbors noticed. Not rot, not death, but cold cabbage, hard carrots, and smoked meat, fresh as if it had just come out of the smokehouse. In the dead of February, when their own pantries stank of spoilage, ice boxes sputtering useless, and shelves stood bare or frosted with ruined beans, that widow, Mary Halcombe, she didn't just have food, she had perfect food, and no one knew how, not in that cracked, sunken shack, not with her roof patched in canvas and a chimney that barely puffed. She had no husband, no hired hands, just 2 children and a spade, and that damn cellar they laughed at in August. Now the whole town was watching her smoke curl from the crooked stovepipe, wondering what she was feeding those kids, and how it hadn't gone bad, because they'd all heard the same thing. Her boy was still eating apples. The sheriff's wife whispered it first, that she'd seen the boy bite into a red one like it was October again. And he didn't hide it. He stood in front of the mercantile window with juice running down his wrist, and a look like he knew people were watching, maybe even dared them to ask. But no one did, because if you had to ask why a widow had fresh fruit in a winter like this, you'd have to admit you didn't. And no man liked admitting that, especially not when their own potatoes had gone soft and grey in their cellars, or frozen stiff in glass-boxed ice sheds they paid Eastern companies to build. Not when every new trick and contraption had failed, and all their shiny new fridges had whirred and coughed and died the second the snow piled deep enough to block the venting. But Mary's hole in the ground hadn't failed. That's what they'd called it. Primitive, foolish, a waste of time. She dug it herself that summer, while the rest of them were paying traveling builders and ordering modern stoves from catalogs. They mocked her even then, called it a prairie mole's tunnel, said she was burying more than food, that maybe she still hadn't buried her husband right. But when the frost hit early and stayed too long, when the river flash froze overnight, and even the meat hanging in pantries turned sour and black in a week, Mary's cellar held, and that drove people madder than hunger, because it meant she knew something they didn't, something from before the manuals and the models, before copper coils and fire bricks and thermoelectric fans, before improvement, something that worked better than all their new tricks, something old, something quiet, and they hated her for it. They hated her even more when the doctor's wife got desperate enough to knock. It was mid-January. 3 feet of snow on the ridge and a wind that carved through wool. No one went out unless something was dying. That's how they knew it was serious. The doctor's little girl hadn't kept food down in 2 days. Her mother had run out of broth. The chickens weren't laying, and the store had nothing but pickled onions and flour riddled with weevils. She came alone, no coat, just a shawl and desperation in her eyes. And Mary let her in. No one knew what was said, but the girl lived. And 3 days later, the doctor's wife brought back a small sack of salt pork and 2 split logs. Payment maybe, or thanks. Either way, it confirmed everything. Mary had food, Mary had heat, and Mary didn't need anybody. That's when the whispers turned dark. Some said she'd been hoarding since spring. Others said she'd struck some kind of deal with fur trappers or traveling Mexicans. A few claimed she was keeping something down there, something that preserved her food, and maybe her soul too. Some swore they saw flickering lights underground. Others said no birds landed on her roof, but most just looked at that half-collapsed cabin with suspicion and envy and kept starving until someone tried to steal from her. It was a boy, not hers, a town boy, maybe 15, son of one of the livery men. He slipped down the side trail before dawn and tried to pry open the cellar's plank door. The snow muffled everything but the hammering, sharp cracks as he tried to wedge it free. But Mary heard, or maybe she always knew. She came out barefoot, and she didn't shout, didn't run, just stood there in the snow, hair down, hands red from washing, and watched the boy freeze in place like he'd seen a ghost. She didn't curse. She didn't raise her voice. She just said one thing: "You'll rot faster than my apples, boy." And that was the end of it. The boy never went near her again, nor did anyone else, because word spread fast, not just about her food, but about how she'd spoken, calm, cold, like a woman who wasn't scared of death, or men, like someone who meant it and who could afford to. The sheriff paid her a visit 2 days later, friendly on the surface, said he was checking in on folks, but he lingered on that cellar door, asked too many questions, mentioned county laws. She served him boiled beans and cornbread so warm it steamed, and said nothing. He didn't come back, but his wife did, and that's how it began. Quiet visits, little exchanges, a small ham for sewing repairs, a jar of cabbage for boots mended. No money, just trade. But Mary never asked. They offered, and only once. If they came twice, she turned them away. It was her way. No begging, no bartering, just mercy, once. And behind all that, the mystery of the cellar grew. It wasn't wide. Just a slope near the back of her cabin, framed with split logs and a warped door reinforced with stone. No lock, no vent pipe, no visible heat source, and yet it worked, not just for food, but perfectly. Better than any mechanical icebox in town. No freezing, no rot, just stable, cold, earthy stillness, and preservation, as if time had stopped. Some said it was the soil, others said she'd lined it with something, ashes, sand, moss, or maybe the way she stacked the food. Root crops lowest, jars up high, nothing touching the walls. But no one knew for sure, because no one had been inside since her husband built the first version of it 10 years ago, before he fell through the ice and never came back. They'd laughed when she rebuilt it, called it grief digging, said she'd never last the winter alone. But now it was mid-February, and she hadn't lost a pound. Her children's cheeks were red with warmth, and her root cellar, primitive, dark, and old-fashioned, had done what no man's fancy equipment could. It had kept them alive, and what no one saw, what no one could ever guess, was what she kept in the very back corner, wrapped in cloth, buried behind barrels. Something older than even the cellar itself, something her grandmother once taught her in whispers no one believed anymore. A trick so old it was mistaken for myth, a trick she hadn't spoken aloud in years, but she used it, quietly, lovingly, with every jar she sealed, with every root she stored, and it had never failed her, not once. But that secret wouldn't stay hidden much longer, because the widow knew what was coming next. Someone was going to try and take it, and the last time someone tried that, a man died. The first true blizzard came down like a curse that night, sweeping hard off the western ridge and smashing through the pine barrier like it hated every inch of soil it touched. It came down screaming, a wind that howled so sharp it seemed to flay the boards off homes and hurl the pastures into confusion. Chickens froze mid-step, horses refused to leave their stalls, and men who'd boasted about their coal stoves and double-insulated pantries huddled like frightened dogs beside fires that never seemed to burn hot enough. By dawn, 3 roofs had collapsed. The church bell tower lost its top, and 2 cabins stood gutted by flame, not from the cold, but from the desperate burning of anything flammable to stave it off. But the widow's house still stood, crooked, half-buried, leaning to one side, like an old drunk, but standing. And from the twisted chimney, a ribbon of smoke drifted soft and constant, like breath from a sleeping beast. The snow blanketed her roof the same as any other, but nothing cracked, nothing fell, because Mary had packed the rafters herself, mud between beams, straw stuffed deep, even old hides tacked to the north wall. Primitive, ugly, but not a single board had blown loose. And her cellar, unchanged, 3 feet under snow now, its slope hidden, the doorway just a black scar on a white hill. But inside, it was still 38 degrees, just like it had been since the first frost back in September. The carrots were still firm, the onions still dry, and the last of the salt pork, pulled from its crocks and hung gently to dry on her rafters, gave off a smell so rich her daughter called it sweet bacon, even if it was more fat than meat. They were warm, they were fed, and they were quiet, until the noise came again, not from outside, not the storm, but the knock, faint, hesitant. It came at dusk, when the sky went blue-black and the candles flickered like they knew something. Mary was stirring beans. Her son was stoking the stove. Her daughter had just come back up from the cellar, cheeks ruddy and arms full of turnips. But that knock, it made them all stop. 3 soft taps, then a silence so deep it throbbed. She didn't open the door at first, just waited. And it came again, louder this time, still only 3, but no voice, no name. She slid the bolt slowly. The man outside wasn't from town. His boots were too clean, his coat too smooth, no frostbite on his cheeks, no burn marks from dragging wood or hauling water. And he had gloves, new leather gloves, untouched by work. That's how she knew, not by his face, though that too was smooth, like someone who'd shaved that morning, but by his hands. Men with clean hands had never done her any good. "Evening, ma'am," he said. Mary said nothing. He held up his palms in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to startle you, just passing through. Got turned around up the ridge. Was wondering if you had something warm, and maybe a place to wait out the wind." Mary stared at him, a long moment, then longer still. He wasn't cold enough, not shaking, not stiff, no snow crusted on his shoulders, and his breath, barely visible, like someone who hadn't been outside long. "Where's your horse?" she asked. He blinked. "Back down the trail, got spooked, ran off. No tracks. Wind covered 'em. No saddle on your back." A pause, then a smile. "You got a sharp eye." She shut the door, but he didn't leave. The third knock was heavier, not violent, but firm, like someone reminding you they had time and intention. Mary didn't answer this time, just pulled the stove door open and fed it a split log. The room glowed orange. Her children stared at her in silence. They'd learned not to ask when her jaw clenched like that. He didn't knock again that night, but she didn't sleep either. She stayed in the chair, a wool blanket on her lap and the small kettle hissing sitting low beside her, eyes wide, waiting. The next morning, she found footprints circling the house. Too many to count, deep ones, heavy, not from boots like his, more like men who wore worn leather and carried weight. But there were no sled tracks, no pack mules, just circling steps, and one boot print at the cellar door. She shoveled it clean before her children came outside, said nothing, just handed them pails and pointed toward the well. But in her mind, something was cracking, because it wasn't just hunger anymore. This wasn't about beans or apples or cabbage in the cold. This was about them knowing, about someone finally deciding that what she had wasn't just enviable, but valuable, and that meant they wouldn't ask twice. She knew the kind of men who didn't ask. Twice, she'd buried one. The next week passed with an eerie silence. The storm broke, skies cleared, but the cold deepened, bone cold, the kind that made bark explode off trees and split nails in beams. The town froze in place. No sermons, no store bell. The blacksmith's forge stayed cold. Even the saloon served broth instead of whiskey. Men huddled indoors. Wives scraped the last of their pickled stores, and children went quiet from hunger too constant to cry about. And Mary's smoke never stopped. One day, a note appeared on her cellar door, slipped under a rock. "We'll take it easy if you show us how. Otherwise we break it." No name, no mark, just that. She didn't show the children, burned the paper, went down into the cellar that night, and stayed there 3 hours. When she came back up, her face looked different, not afraid, but resolved. She told the children they'd be sleeping in the loft from now on. She laid bricks across the hatch to the cellar and covered them with a rug. She hammered a wedge into the back door frame so it stuck even when unlocked, and she boiled 3 full kettles of water, then left them under the windows. Her son asked why. She just said, "Because they're coming," and they did. 2 nights later, no knock, no warning, just a sudden thump against the back wall, followed by a hiss of air, where something had been wedged to muffle the window frame. Then boots, at least 3 pairs, and voices, low, gruff, urgent. Mary didn't grab a rifle. She didn't have one. Her husband had sold it before he drowned, and she'd never had the coin to buy another. She took the poker instead, and the kettle. The first man came through the window. He dropped inside fast, not expecting a fight, just shadows and food. But Mary met him mid-step, poker swinging low and hot water flung at his face. He screamed. Boiling water on a frost-bitten cheek cuts deeper than knives. He fell backward out the frame. The second man hesitated, and that was enough. She slammed the shutter shut and wedged it with the iron. They tried the door next, but it was already bricked. When they started kicking, she didn't move to stop them, just let the bricks fall, because behind that door, at the top of the cellar slope, was the trick, the old one. Her grandmother called it sleeping fire. Just a simple thing, really. A bed of embers, sealed in clay, buried beneath sand and stone. It kept warmth stable, not hot, not dry, just alive. A breath of heat, enough to stave off frost, enough to preserve food. But if you cracked the shell, let in air too fast, it woke up. They broke the last of the bricks, rushed the door, and met the fire. It wasn't an explosion, not flames, just heat, sudden, steaming heat from the breath of trapped embers mixing with cold air and condensation. A wall of moist steam, blinding, suffocating, scalding enough to burn skin raw. One man screamed, one fell, the third ran. Mary never stepped outside. She just waited until the silence returned, then dragged the bodies off the slope and left them in the snow. Not dead, not quite, but marked. The sheriff never came. Maybe he'd heard. Maybe he'd been warned. Maybe he'd been told to stay away. But the townspeople saw, and something shifted. A week later, 3 women knocked, not all at once. One in the morning, one in the evening, and one late at night with a bruised cheek and a shivering child. They didn't ask for food. They didn't say what had happened. They just stood there. Mary let them in. They slept in the loft, ate boiled carrots and dried beans. And when they left changed. Quieter, straighter, like something inside had strengthened. And Mary's secret, if it was still a secret, was no longer hers alone. Because what she'd built, what she'd preserved, wasn't just food. It was independence, a way to live when the rest of the world tried to own you, a way to say no when everything else said yes, or die. And the cellar, primitive, quiet, dirt-packed, wasn't a relic. It was a weapon, and now others wanted one too. But Mary had one more secret. She wasn't the only one who knew how to build it. Because years ago, before the rail lines, before the stores, before the catalogues of fine inventions and big Eastern ideas, there had been another woman, one who lived farther in the hills, one who taught her everything. And now, Mary was thinking about finding her again, because this winter wasn't the last, and next time, they might not knock first. The thaw came late that year, so late that calves were born into snowbanks, and men broke axes on frost-thick logs that should have split easy by March. Trees wept ice, not sap, and the river stayed locked beneath a glassy crust that cracked like bone but never gave. The valley whispered rumors of a second freeze, worse than the first, and for once, no one laughed at superstition. Every settler watched the skies now, like they were being judged, because something had changed, something had broken loose under the snow, and it wasn't just the cold. Mary watched too, but not with fear, not anymore. The fear had passed after the men came for her cellar and left burned, broken, or missing. What remained now was something else, something like weight, a realization that the world was leaning in closer, that others would come, not out of need this time, but interest, because word had traveled, first across town, then to the next ridge, and now, through trapper trails and old postal paths, to settlements Mary hadn't heard mentioned in 10 years, places where names faded fast, but rumors stuck to boots like mud. They didn't call her Mary Halcombe out there. They called her the Cold Widow, said she'd cracked some old world secret, said her root cellar could raise the dead or hold a flame under snow. She was becoming a story, and stories draw men. The first stranger came at dusk again, late March. The sun had dipped, but hadn't vanished. The snow had melted just enough to make things muddy, and the ridge trail behind her cabin showed the track of a heavy wagon, not the kind drawn by hunger. No, this was something else. He came alone, at first, well-dressed, clean-faced, sharp-eyed. Same type as before, but smoother. He knocked once, didn't wait for a reply before stepping back, tilting his hat respectfully toward the window. "Evening, ma'am," he said, voice calm like a banker reading from a ledger. "Heard about your little marvel here. Came to make you a proposition." Mary didn't move, just watched him from inside, eyes level with the curtain seam. "I represent a group of businessmen," he went on. "They're interested in practical solutions, food storage, winter protection. We heard your method survived the worst freeze in living memory. That's valuable." He shifted a little, waiting, measuring her silence. "We'd like to purchase your design, exclusive rights. We'd handle distribution, construction. You wouldn't need to lift a finger again." Still, Mary said nothing. "We're prepared to offer generous compensation, coin, land, even relocation if this place is unpleasant." Now she stepped to the door, but she didn't open it. Her voice came low through the timber, steady as ever. "You're 3 months too late." A pause. He smiled, confused. "I'm sorry," she answered without inflection. "The offer came 3 months ago. Wasn't an offer then, just theft. Didn't go well." His smile didn't vanish, but it flattened, turned more professional. "I understand. That wasn't authorized. These men, whoever they weren't acting on our behalf. I assure you, this is a legitimate proposal, one that honors your contribution and compensates you fairly. You don't know what it is," he hesitated. "The cellar. It's not something you can write down and build somewhere else." His voice hardened slightly. "Ma'am, with respect, everything can be written down. Everything can be copied." Mary finally opened the door. He straightened, surprised, almost smiled again, but the look in her eyes stopped him. "Then copy the earth," she said. "Copy the way it breathes when it's been undisturbed 100 years. Copy the way moisture holds against moss stone and clay packed by hand. Copy silence. Copy shame and patience and grief. Copy that, and maybe your ice boxes will work." He looked at her, really looked for the first time, and saw not a widow with tricks, but a woman who understood something he never would, something earned through years of bending, failing, bleeding. He tried to speak. She shut the door. He didn't knock again, but 2 days later, she saw him again, on the road further down, this time with 5 men, all dressed like builders. They didn't come up the path. They just stood at a distance, looked at the hillside, the structure, took notes, then rode on. That's when she knew it wouldn't end with them. They'd come back, and when they did, it wouldn't be with offers. By April, the snow melted for good, but the cold didn't leave. It clung in pockets, under trees, inside wells, and deep in the bones of cabins where families had used up the last of their stores before Easter. There was no feast that year, just salt pork too thin to flavor beans, and seed potatoes kept back with shaking hands. No one planted early. They feared the frost would cheat them again. And everywhere there was suspicion, because Mary still had food. Less than before, yes, but still enough. Enough that she never begged. Enough that she still let women come, quietly, and leave with small sacks. Enough that she never set foot in the store. And that alone was enough to stoke every coal of jealousy into flame. The sheriff came by again in May. This time he didn't smile. "You got men asking questions," he said, not even pretending to be polite. Out-of-towners. Don't like your attitude. Don't like you building things that make their clients look like fools. Mary didn't look up from her hoe. She was turning the soil by hand that morning, bare-knuckled, the earth wet and dark around her nails. You mean the ones who stole plans that never existed? He didn't answer, just stared, then shifted in his boots, scraping mud off on a stone. They're saying you're storing contraband, claiming you've got military designs buried down there. Some say you're hiding people. Don't care what it is. Just want to know you're not bringing trouble to our town. Mary straightened. Her eyes were bloodshot from the sun. Her back ached, but she stood tall. I never brought a thing, she said. Only thing I did was stay. The sheriff shifted again, eyes narrowing. Well, maybe it's time you left. Who told you to say that? She asked. He flinched, just enough. You've been in this valley longer than I have, she said. You know what winter's really like? You know, those men don't understand it. They think cold is a thermometer number. They don't know what it means to dig out your child's boots from the frozen doorframe. You know. He didn't answer, didn't move, but his jaw tightened. Then quietly he turned and walked off. She didn't see him again, but she saw others. By June, surveyors were arriving. Men with scopes, maps, and ink on their fingertips. They didn't talk to her. They just walked the land, measured slopes, drew angles, took soil samples, pretended not to stare at the cellar. She made no move to stop them, because by then she wasn't protecting a secret anymore. She was preparing for a fight. It wasn't just the cellar now. She'd spent the last month reshaping everything. Her cabin had been reinforced, logs replaced, sod roof mended. The ridge behind her was now tiered with trench lines, disguised as gardening beds. Barrels had been buried upright at odd intervals, filled with stone and pitch. Her root cellar entrance had been doubled, one visible, one hidden. Her daughter, now 13, carried a knife at all times. Her son had rigged a system of bells with string through the pine trees. Nothing crossed into her land without her knowing. But what they didn't see, what none of the men ever noticed, was the second cellar, not dug by her, dug by her grandmother, back when this land had no fences and no men riding out with papers and contracts. It had been hidden under the old barn, now collapsed, its entrance nothing more than a sunken patch of earth under a pile of hay bales. In that second cellar were things no paper could capture, tools, not the kind made of steel, but knowledge passed by hand, soil sacks, layered to preserve humidity, stone shelves curved to mimic airflow in lungs, wax-treated baskets woven tight and soft, and the recipe, a soot-covered scrap, written in her grandmother's fading hand, explaining how to make the sleeping fire, the real fire, the kind that breathed slow, that didn't cook but preserved, a breath of warmth, not flame, the kind that made modern refrigeration look like children's toys. And Mary had built it again, not just for herself this time. She'd begun teaching others. 3 women came regularly now, always at night. They stayed silent in the woods until she called them forward. They took notes, dug, watched, practiced. One had lost her son last winter. Another had nearly gone blind from malnutrition. The third had been beaten for asking her husband why the meat spoiled again. Now, they stood with calloused hands and steady eyes. They didn't want to sell a design. They wanted to survive. And Mary knew, deep in her marrow, that these women were the future. Not the men with blueprints and coin, but the ones who listened, who learned, who carried old truths forward. But time was running out, because in the second week of July, a man arrived with a uniform and a letter with a seal, and he wasn't asking. The man didn't wear a gun, but he wore something colder, confidence wrapped in entitlement. A pressed wool coat, dark blue, buttoned high, with the insignia of the state stitched above the collar. His boots shone, even after the climb. His gloves were stitched fine and pale, not from cold, but from soft hands that had never held a hoe or split kindling. His words were slow, not lazy, but deliberate, as if every syllable had a seal behind it. "Mary Halcombe?" She said nothing. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't even called out. Just stood there in the middle of her field, like he already owned the land beneath his boots. The women who had been helping her that day fell back into the cabin, one of them pulling the child in by the collar. Mary kept her hoe resting against her shoulder, but stepped down from the garden row slowly, the sun casting her shadow long across the tilled soil. "I represent a commission backed by your state," he began. "We've been informed of a construction on this property, a facility that utilizes non-registered methods of thermic preservation. We believe you may be in possession of unlicensed technology with agricultural application." He looked at her the way a man studies a strange rock, curious but already thinking about how to break it open. "You're not from the state," she said finally, voice dry. "You're from that group, the ones that tried to steal it." A brief pause, then the smile again, just as practiced. "I'm from both. See, that's the part you don't understand, Mrs. Halcombe. Or maybe maybe you do. It's all one and the same. The men who tried to buy you are the same ones who fund the public interest commissions, the ones who sent me. And if we can't buy it, we regulate it. And if we can't regulate it, he let that trail off. Let her fill in the end. Mary didn't blink. What do you want? We want the design, the method, the soil samples, the construction notes. We want you to stop teaching women in secret, and we want your cellar dismantled and moved to a laboratory where it can be replicated, tested, and improved. And if I say no, his smile widened, you won't have to, because this here, he reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet with a stamped seal, is an order of requisition, declaring this entire slope an experimental site under agricultural development. It gives the Commission full right to inspect, seize, and alter anything we deem necessary, starting tomorrow. Mary didn't take the paper. Instead, she said, you should leave now. He did, but slowly, turning only after a long stare, tucking the paper back in his coat like it was a weapon she'd failed to fear. That night, the women didn't leave. Mary didn't ask them to stay. They just did. The fire burned low, not from lack of fuel, but to keep light from spilling out. The house was quiet, but awake, every board creaking like a whisper. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was short, sharp, and final. They'll come with more men, the eldest woman said. Not just officials, maybe sheriff's men, maybe worse, Mary nodded. They'll go for the second cellar, the younger one whispered. They've seen too much now. Mary said nothing, because it was true, and she knew exactly what they'd do. They'd come with papers and force and public language, pretending it was all part of some lawful process. But underneath that, it would be hunger and greed, and men who couldn't bear to be outdone by a widow with a spade. She reached into her apron, pulled out the old scrap, the soot-marked recipe her grandmother had written. It had faded further, a corner burned, the lines fragile now, but still legible. She handed it to the youngest woman. Memorize it, Mary said. Then burn it. Don't let the ink do the remembering for you. Let your hands do it. That girl, no older than 16, held it like a letter from heaven, eyes flicking back and forth, mouthing the words under breath. They waited until dawn. The officials arrived in full at sunrise. 8 men, 1 wagon, 2 armed guards, 1 man with a writing board, and the man from before walking at the front like he was already taking measurements for a foundation. They came without announcement. No townfolk followed. The townspeople had learned better than to get involved now. Mary stood on the slope, arms crossed. Behind her, the door to the root cellar yawned slightly open, just enough to look like an invitation. The man with the seal held up the same document again, more formal now. We're commencing inspection, he said. Do not interfere. Mary stepped aside, didn't speak, let them enter. The man ducked inside first, followed by 3 more. One of the guards waited at the door. The rest fanned out, checking the grounds, sketching the slope, measuring depth. They were inside for 10 minutes. Then came the scream. It wasn't pain, not fear exactly, something else. Confusion twisted into terror. A noise that said, "This isn't right." One man scrambled out first, crawling backward, clothes soaked in cold sweat. Another staggered after, coughing, choking, eyes wide as if he'd been strangled by something invisible. The third never emerged. Mary said nothing. The lead man stormed out last, red-faced and trembling, but not from cold. "What did you put in there?" he barked. "What kind of trap is this?" Mary raised an eyebrow. "You said it was a facility. You didn't ask how it worked." He shoved a hand through his hair, pacing wildly. "That room isn't natural. The temperature's wrong. The pressure's wrong. The air, it doesn't move like it should." Mary didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just said the one thing she knew would break him. "You opened the sleeping fire." His face lost color. "We sealed it again," she said calmly. "But not fast enough, I guess." The youngest official collapsed on the grass and vomited. The armed guards looked nervous now. One of them stepped back toward the wagon, hand hovering near his belt. The man with the clipboard had stopped writing entirely. Mary walked forward, slow and steady. "This cellar wasn't made to be copied. It wasn't built for profit or process or patents. It was built because I was tired of watching children starve. It was built because every man who said he'd help us ended up selling us out. It was built because survival doesn't come from metal boxes and Eastern blueprints. It comes from knowing the earth." The lead man glared at her. "You think you've won? I think I've outlasted you," she said. He stormed toward the wagon. "This isn't over." But she didn't respond, because she knew it was. Not in a dramatic final sense, not like the end of a tale, but in the way that seasons end, slowly and all at once. The men would retreat, new ones might come, but the fear was gone now. The moment of seizure had passed, because they'd entered the cellar, and it hadn't let them take anything. In fact, it had taken something from them. That summer, Mary taught openly, not in the fields, not in the cabin, but under the trees behind the house, where the soil stayed cool and the roots ran deep. She taught women from as far as 30 miles, women who came with calloused hands, babies on their backs, Husbands lost to war or whiskey. Women who didn't ask for proof, just instruction. She showed them how to dig the slope, how to select the stones, how to layer the walls so condensation wouldn't pool, how to seal jars, not with paraffin, but with beeswax and braided reed, how to feel the earth breathe, when to open, when to close, when to feed the sleeping fire, and when to starve it. She never wrote it down. Neither did they. They learned the old way, by repetition, by failure, by skin and sweat, by loss. She never named the second cellar, never showed it again, but they all knew it was there, just as they knew that what they were learning wasn't just construction, it was defiance, it was continuance. Some of the women began to build their own, others just stayed, camped on her land, tilled rows beside hers, watched her daughter grow into someone fierce, someone steady, watched her son build wind traps from old wheel spokes and reeds, to funnel air into deeper chambers. And the town changed too, quietly, subtly. Men stopped coming with clipboards. Stores began stocking less imported goods and more bartered ones. The mercantile stopped pushing fridges and started offering cellar tools again. A few neighbors nodded at her on the road. Even the sheriff's wife left a sack of cornmeal on her porch one morning. No note, but warm still from the oven. Mary didn't speak of it much. She didn't tell them about the days she cried into the soil, or the nights she whispered to ghosts in the firelight, or the time she nearly sealed the cellar forever after her husband died. She just taught and planted and watched, because she knew the winters would come again, and she wasn't interested in being a legend. She was building a legacy, and this time she wouldn't be the only one. The winter that followed was the worst in living memory. Not just cold, not just long, but wrong. Snow came down in early October, thick and silent, days before the leaves had even dropped. It didn't melt, didn't soften, just stayed. First on the hills, then the roads, then the roofs, until the whole valley was white and grey before the harvest was even done. The streams froze sideways before they finished their bends, wells choked with brittle ice, logs wouldn't burn right, too damp, too green, and the sky never brightened. It was like God had turned his face from the land. They lost animals. Chickens froze in coops, oxen fell in their tracks. The wind found cracks no one remembered cutting. For weeks, firewood ran short, the store closed, deliveries stopped, and even the sheriff went quiet. But Mary's land remained still. No smoke, not this time, not until the last possible moment, because she knew this time they would watch for it, wait for it, and they'd come not with threats or letters or gold, but with desperation, and desperation was always the most dangerous thing, so she waited. They'd planted early that year, she and the women, not because the signs told them, but because their bones did. They harvested in shifts, canned, jarred, dried, salted, dug new root beds, built 3 more cellars, each slightly different, each slightly better. They sealed them tight, let the fire sleep, covered the openings with stones and snow and silence, then waited. And when the town finally began to crack, when the children began showing up with bruised lips from biting ice to feel full, and when the men started raiding each other's coops at night, Mary sent her daughter out, just once, just enough. The girl walked through the heart of town with a basket of turnips and a single loaf of coarse bread. She handed it to the preacher's wife, said nothing, and left. It took 2 days for the first knock. This time it wasn't a man, it was a woman, wrapped in rags, eyes sunk deep, dragging a boy with her. No begging, just standing, waiting. The boy didn't even look up. Mary let them in. She fed them boiled cabbage. Not much, just enough. Then she handed the woman a shovel. "Don't ask for it," Mary said. "Build it." The woman nodded. Word spread, and they began to arrive, not in groups, but in ones and twos. Always women, always silent, always with the same look, that haunted, tight-lipped stillness of someone who had waited too long to scream. And Mary gave them all the same thing. Not food, not warmth, a spade, a lesson, and a place to dig. They didn't return to the town, not all of them. Some sent letters, some sent nothing. But what they did send, slowly over that winter, were signs. Cabbage leaves pressed in wax, notes sealed in flour sacks, a child's mitten stuffed with dry moss, messages, clues, proofs. It was working. Not everywhere, not perfectly. Some cellars caved, some fires died, but others held, others fed. Mary kept track by candlelight. She never drew a map, but she had one in her mind. She could feel the shape of it growing across the hills, like roots, quiet and slow and unseen. A network, and not one she controlled, because that was the final truth of it, the secret no man with his charts and seals could ever grasp. It wasn't about her cellar, it was about the knowledge, not what was written but what was kept, in bodies, in hands, in scars, in memory. Her grandmother hadn't written it down because it wasn't meant to be owned, it was meant to live, like the fire, like the soil, like grief. That spring, the freeze broke late again. The sun came, shyly. The river snapped its crust with a scream like an animal's death. The trees exhaled mist. The world limped back into green, but the town never fully recovered. Some families left, some gave up their claims. A few took the eastern line and never looked back, but others stayed, and something shifted. No one sold iceboxes anymore. No one laughed at digging. No one mocked the women who kept baskets under tarps or hauled jars from below instead of buying from the mercantile. In fact, that mercantile got a new owner, a woman. She started stocking different things: beeswax, coarse salt, woven baskets, rough gloves. She painted a sign over the counter: no credit, no cheating, no cold hearts. Mary only went in once, to nod. But the town understood. She had won, not with violence, not with wealth, but with truth. Truth so old it had become invisible. Truth buried in dirt and breath and patience. Years later, a man came up the trail again. Older, leaner, not dressed in uniform. His boots were worn now, his coat patched. He didn't come to buy, didn't come to steal. He came to ask. He stood at the same edge of the garden, hat in hand. "I want to learn," he said. Mary looked at him a long time, then handed him a spade. They say now that the cold widow never died, that she lives in cellars across the land, in the warm breath of a carrot stored too long, in the fog on a jar's lid, in the stillness of stone and the hum of roots. They say her fire still sleeps underground, waiting, not to be sold, but to be remembered, because no machine has ever kept food as long, and no man ever matched her cellar's quiet strength. And while modern fridges fail in weeks, wasting light and humming like dying bees, her primitive hole in the earth still keeps food fresh all winter long, without a sound, without a seal, just dirt, fire, and a woman who refused to forget.